All right, so here we go with the last video for chapter 26. Remember, this is the kind of like video 5B, right? It's the second video for section 5 talking about the Russian Revolution. And let's pick up with the Civil War. So after the Bolsheviks gained control, one of the first things Lenin did was sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This treaty officially removed Russia from the war. It also gave up a pretty large chunk of its old territory. Okay, so you see the orange area was ceded to Germany. Other areas went to Austria-Hungary. Some of these areas would eventually be given independence. Okay, Poland would be a country that would eventually gain its independence. Ukraine would be down and around here, although Russia would gain some of this back. So even though they paid a pretty high price, Lenin believed that it was necessary in order to get out of the war because he felt that Russia needed to put all of its resources into building a new government rather than fight against Germany. Now, right after this fighting broke out within Russia, you had the whites versus the reds. Now, the reds were the communists. Since red is the color of communism. The whites were a mix of different groups, but they were mostly Tsar loyalists, okay, people who wanted to put the Tsar back on the throne. Now, there was some foreign involvement as the Allies supported the whites. The hope was that if the whites were victorious, then Russia would re-enter the war on the side of the Allies. This did give the white support in the way of guns and supplies. However, it actually turned the people against the whites since they were being backed by foreigners, right? The Reds capitalized on this and kind of portrayed themselves as being the true Russian nationalists. They said, oh, the foreigners are helping our enemies. The people should side with us. So ultimately, the Reds were victorious. It was a pretty bloody war, but the Reds won. And this was largely through their use of what became known as war communism. The Reds made regular use of terror. They made widespread use of the Cheka, or the secret police, to spy on citizens. They even executed private citizens, all in order to keep control. They also were responsible at this time of executing the Tsar and his family. Remember, we said that after the March Revolution, the Tsar was removed from power, but he was not killed. He was kept under house arrest with his family. Well, eventually they realized that having the Tsar alive was too much of a rallying cry for the whites, and so he needed to go. And unfortunately for his family, they said that they all needed to go as well. So Tsar Nicholas, his wife, and their children were all taken into the basement of the home, which they were kept under house arrest, and they were executed. So that would end the last of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. All right, so getting back with war communism. Remember, communism is all about government control, and that's what the Reds did here. There was a takeover of the crops, the banks, the industry. Right? They confiscated crops to feed the troops. They forced factories to produce for the war effort. They even drafted peasants into the Red Army. It was all about firing the people up for their side. You know, the use of propaganda. All right? We've talked about that in the past as well. Another big reason for the Red victory was the leadership of this man, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was Lenin's right-hand man, and he really was responsible for turning the Red Army into an effective fighting force. Now, after their victory, the communists set out to build up Russia by turning it into a new country, and this new country was named the Soviet Union. It was formed in 1922, and the more formal name for it is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, better known as the USSR. So when I use the term USSR and the Soviet Union, they are used interchangeably, okay? They both refer to the same thing. Now, this united much of the old Russian Empire. Let me just erase this. All right, so you had a lot of those states from the old Russian Empire. They regained those Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and then you got your Stan countries in here, all of those Central Asian ones. So it was a multinational state, but was dominated by Russia. All right, Russia is going, obviously, it makes up the majority of it, and most of the power is here in Western Russia. Moscow's there, St. Petersburg is there, although they start to rename some of those cities. The Russians, they control the majority of the government and the military position. This also led to some resentment by these other non-Russian peoples within it. They felt like they were left out. So a new constitution was formed. They elected a legislator called the Supreme Soviet, but real power was with the Communist Party. The Communist Party was the only legal party, and it ruled through the army and the secret police. Now, we're going to talk more about how the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, meaning the government had total control over everything. We're going to talk more about that in a later chapter. But this new Soviet Union, right after it came into creation, it encountered a number of problems. And this forced Lenin to adopt an economic policy known as the New Economic Policy, or we'll just shorten it to NEP. So war communism had wrecked the economy. It brought the economy to close to collapse. So Lenin adopted the NEP to bring some capitalist policies into it. Now remember that capitalism is about the private ownership of industries, which is the opposite of communism. But Lenin was smart enough to recognize that he had to swallow his pride and that a little bit of private ownership was necessary to jumpstart the economy. Under the NEP, the government controlled the big stuff, right? They controlled the banks, trade, and industry. So this remains still pretty communist. But small businesses and farms were allowed to be owned privately, right? So again, it's a little bit, right? We say some capitalist policies. You had a lot of people in the Communist Party that didn't like it, but the NEP did result in economic recovery, okay? There was production that was going on. Now, Lenin always saw the NEP as a temporary fix, and he planned on returning the USSR to pure communism. This full transition back to communism, though, wouldn't be done by him, as he died in 1924. And we're going to talk more about his successor, Joseph Stalin, in chapter 28. So that wraps up talking about how the Russian revolutions, led into a Russian civil war, and how the Bolsheviks, the Reds, the communists, they would take control, and Lenin would help create the Soviet Union.